Hello, everyone. This is Royce Eddings, and I want to thank everyone for joining me on my Royce in the House YouTube channel. You know, we all have stories to tell about our hell-raising days with our friends. Maybe even a few that we, wouldn't talk about with anyone but the friends that were actually there. But tonight, we're going to be talking about Alice Cooper and the hell-raising days with his friends. This is the story of the Hollywood Vampires Drinking Club. Before there was a band, the Hollywood Vampires, there was a Hollywood Vampires Drinking Club, both of which were formed by Alice Cooper. Okay, so it starts out, the Hollywood Vampires Celebrity Drinking Club, formed by Alice Cooper in the early 70s. The initiation to the club was to outdrink all of the other members. There was a little loft above the Rainbow Bar and Grill in West Hollywood that was reserved for members only of the Hollywood Drinking Club. Okay, the group of musicians created this club to hang out with one another and to drink large amounts of alcohol. Okay, so Alice Cooper, president; Keith Moon, vice president; Bob Brown, Alice Cooper's publicist, was a treasurer. Then we had Ringo Starr, MICKY DOLENZ, Harry Nilsson, all charter members. It was that crowd every night. But others would come by, other rock stars would come by, and they were made honorary members for the night, and they would hang out with the guys. You know, when John Lennon was in town during his legendary Lost Weekend, which started in 73 and went through early 75. Now, if that's not a hell of a long legendary weekend, I don't know what is. He would always show up. This was during that period of time that he was separated actually from Yoko Ono. So the convergence of Lennon, Nelson, Cooper, Dolenz in 73 would result in many drunken nights, but it also inspired a lot of films, multiple albums, and songs. Most importantly, John Lennon's underappreciated 1974 album, Walls and Bridges. According to Alice, this was a last man standing kind of a thing, okay? You'd go over to the Rainbow Bar and Grill every night. There would be myself, MICKY DOLENZ, Bernie Taupin, Keith Moon, and Harry Nilsson. If John Lennon was in town, he'd always hang out with Harry Nilsson, so John would come by too. Everything became an argument between John Lennon and Harry Nilsson. Alice said that he was like a referee trying to referee these ridiculous arguments. Okay, people started calling us the Hollywood Vampires because we never saw daylight. You know, we figured instead of drinking the blood of the vein, we drink the blood of the vine. Okay, since 1972, the Rainbow Bar and Grill was a home away from home for many rock icons. It rapidly became the hangout place for stars throughout the 70s. However, before becoming the Rainbow Club, it was known as Via Novo, a popular place to be for the biggest stars from the 30s through the 60s, the biggest Hollywood stars, okay? Icons such as Bing Crosby, John Wayne, Judy Garland, they would all show up, okay? It was a popular hangout. The legend goes that actress Marilyn Monroe walked into the Via Novo one night with actor Mickey Rooney and walked out with Yankees legend Joe DiMaggio. This was like considered their first date. And of course, we all know that they wound up getting married for several years afterward. Okay. So Alice had the idea of starting a softball club, also a softball team to play on weekends for charity. They'd play against fire departments, police departments, record labels, boys clubs, and anybody else. They kind of formed their own, informal league is what happened. They got a lot of good press. They raised some money for charity. Alice with Peter Tork from the Monkees as the pitcher, and they described him as a very good pitcher. Now, we're on the team. John Lennon, Harry Nilsson, Keith Moon, these guys would never play baseball, so they never came out. But we'd get up on Sunday, play against some of the other teams around town. We actually practiced, and we were pretty good, says Alice. Okay, we're going to talk about Keith Moon a little bit. Moon the Loon. As far as members of the Hollywood Vampires went, some drank much harder than others and were a bit crazier than others. Hard drinking and a little bit crazier than others absolutely described the notorious Vice President Keith Moon, okay? In an interview, Alice stated, "We knew who the big drinkers were. Keith Moon, we'd go there every night, get a head start because we wanted to see what Keith Moon was going to show up wearing. You know, Keith would go around to all the costume stores and show up in costume. He might show up as the Queen of England in costume. A couple of days later, he might show up dressed like Adolf Hitler, or a French maid's outfit he might wear. We'd all sit around and laugh at him. But then you'd think, well, this guy's the best drummer in the world. He's allowed to do that, says Alice. Okay, Harry Nilsson's 10th album. We're going to talk about that now. It was called the Pussycats. Harry Nilsson, since the 60s, was something of a local lyrical wonderland, and a vocal lyrical wonderland, excuse me, who had taken the musical world by storm with his psychedelic and Beatle-infused debut album, Pandemonium Shadow Show, released in 1967. John Lennon had taken notice of the young artist and declared in the media in 1968, "Nilsson is my favorite group," thinking that Nilsson was the name of Harry's band. Later that same year, Lennon would again state publicly, "Nilsson for president." For Harry Nilsson, Lennon's comments would change his life and career forever. The pair would become lifelong friends after Nilsson traveled to London and visited the Beatles, and subsequently became part of the Fab Four's inner circle. Okay, John Lennon and Harry Nilsson in the studio in Los Angeles during the production of Nilsson's 10th studio album, Pussycats. Lennon served as the album producer and sang backup vocals. Lennon had Nilsson, Ringo Starr, Keith Moon all share a beachfront Santa Monica house together during the Pussycats sessions. Lennon's then girlfriend, May Pang, would later explain why the hard-partying vampires had decided to bunk up together. May Pang said, "Well, this was John's idea. He thought of this because he said, left to their own devices, none of these guys would ever show up at the studio at the same time." Sounds about right in those partying times. So it would never happen. So let's pull everybody together into the same house. This way we could drive as a group and everybody would be getting to the studio at the same time. He just wanted everyone to be there so they could get the album done. Pussycats was his 10th album again by Nilsson. It was released in 1974, produced by John Lennon during the Lost Weekend period of John Lennon, which lasted a couple of years. During his production and recording sessions, the Hollywood Vampires were in full force and effect during the album's production. Nilsson's career would never fully recover after the vocal damage he suffered during the recording sessions. And that's kind of a shame. Okay, John Lennon's Lost Weekend, 1973 through 1974, was an incredibly productive time. He completed 3 albums, Mind Games, Walls and Bridges, and Rock and Roll. He also produced songs for Ringo Starr and Nilsson while recording with David Bowie and Elton John and Mick Jagger. For Nilsson, the mid-70s was a dreamlike time, rich in high-quality cocaine and no strings attached sex. Now, for Lennon, it was a little less utopian than that. The Beatles had recently parted ways. They're in the middle of various legal battles with their manager. And he was still reeling from the public's reaction to his album with Yoko Ono, Sometime in New York City, featuring the track "Woman is the End of the World." To make things worse, relationships between Lennon and Yoko were very strained, and Yoko Ono came up with a plan. Her response in 70s classic style was to set Lennon up with their personal assistant, May Pang, who was corralled by Yoko into joining Lennon on a lost weekend of sex, spirits, and sniff. Okay, left to his own devices, Lennon was a rather chaotic personality, okay, taking to the Brandy Alexanders like a fish to water. This was partly the influence of Harry Nilsson, of course, who was known for treating drinking as an Olympic sport. On March of '73, Lennon and Nilsson got loaded in the Vampire Club and decided to wander over to the Troubadour, where Lennon decided to stick a maxi pad to his forehead, much to the bemusement of the waiter staff. When management accused him bad bar etiquette, a fight broke out in the Troubadour, during which Lennon somehow managed to punch a waitress in the face. A week later, Lennon and Nilsson, again loaded up on cocaine and Brandy Alexander's, returned to the Troubadour, where the comedian duo, the Smothers Brothers, were performing. And they ordered some more drinks, started heckling the Smothers Brothers, yelling profanities, and generally disrupting the performance. Of course, Lennon wasn't the only British member of the Hollywood Vampires with a sordid reputation. According to Cooper, the British were always the worst offenders. The British, for some reason, could hold their liquor better than the Americans. He said, I was a sipper. I could usually last a long time just sipping whiskey, but some of those guys were pounding it down pretty hard. And I don't know how they did it. I was amazed that Keith Moon could drink all night long and show up to play a show the very next day. Lennon would later claim, calm down. Lennon would later calm down, okay? Joining Yoko Ono in a program of primal scream therapy and generally attempting to humble himself for the American public after everything he'd done already. Of course, that was after he had joined Nelson in pissing on Phil Spector's console during the recording of the album Rock and Roll. Okay, so I'm going to tell a little story about Anne Murray here. Okay, Anne Murray and Shep. Legendary talent manager, agent, and film producer Shep Gordon had represented four-time Grammy winner Anne Murray back in 1973. At the time, the 28-year-old Canadian singer was looking to change her image. She was seen as kind of a goody two-shoes, and she needed more edge, you know, and book an appearance on the popular show, The Midnight Special. Well, in LA, the crafty Gordon knew exactly what to do to generate the buzz for Anne Murray. So when I was in this is Anne Murray speaking now. When I was in LA recording, I stayed at Shep's house. Not only was a refrigerator full of booze that you could drink, there was a note from somebody on the counter, and that said, "There's a surprise for you in the drawer." And I looked in the drawer, and there was a huge vial of white powder. Well, what I was looking for from Shep was to create a buzz in the business. And everybody who was anybody came on the Midnight Special. So Shep Gordon said it was a time when hip meant everything. And the last thing Midnight Special wanted was a straight-laced singer from Canada to come on the show. Okay, so one of the techniques that had always worked for him was called guilt by association, which is if you take somebody famous and put them next to somebody, that person melts off the fame. It was John Lennon's dark era, and he was rarely photographed. So if people could get their hands on a photograph with them with John Lennon, it's going to be very, very big, okay? So the whole purpose of that entire night was to get a picture of Anne Murray standing next to these icons who were the coolest people in the world. And this was at the Troubadour, where she was booked to play. Okay, Murray would later say, after getting the picture with Lennon and members of the Hollywood Vampires, the picture had more mileage than any other picture that I've ever had taken for me, says Anne. Rolling Stone wanted to interview me, and I was the it girl for a few weeks. So Anne Murray became the it girl for a few weeks, just getting her picture taken with the Hollywood Vampires and John Lennon, of course. Okay, well, all things must end. Alice Cooper was close friends with and drinking buddies with rock and roll legends Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison kind of took Alice under his wing and would invite him and his band to come down and sit with them during their recording sessions. Subsequently, Alice Cooper wound up doing a lot of drinking with Jim Morrison. They partied a lot together often. Cooper has also stated publicly that the first time he ever smoked marijuana, it was with Jimi Hendrix. So I ended up drinking with Jim a lot of the time. Same with Jimi Hendrix. So even though they weren't around for the Vampires, meaning Jim and Jimmy, we put the two Jims on record as honorary members of the Hollywood Vampires. Now, how cool is that? Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison were listed as honorary members of the Hollywood Vampires. I think that's fantastic. Okay. They taught us how to drink. We fell into it pretty easily, but we also noticed that they weren't just drinking. There was a lot of pills and other drugs going on at that time. I was not doing that. I was just drinking, says Alice. And so Alice Cooper reflected, when I watched Jim and Jimmy die at 27 years old, it was one of those things where I knew I was going to come to a crossroads, a point at which I was going to have to make a decision either to join my friends on the other side or to quit drinking and go on and make another 20 albums. It came down to that decision one morning when Alice Cooper woke up and started throwing up blood. He thought his pancreas was infected. At the doctor's office, the doctor told Alice, you can either stop drinking, you can either keep drinking and join your friends, or you can stop drinking and go on to make more albums. And it really wasn't a tough decision to make for Alice. He had to stop drinking. Steven Tyler came to that point. Iggy Pop came to that point. I think everyone that's still out there from my generation realized they were going to come to this crossroads at some point. And you know what? I can totally relate to that because I came from that same era myself, and we did a lot of partying. And I'll tell you what, I lost a lot of friends, and some of them are still dying today early because of the partying they did back then. So by the mid-1970s, time and mortality had taken their toll on the founding and early members. Some had survived and some didn't. Okay, so by the late 1970s, John Belushi, Keith Emerson, Mark Bolan, and so many other legendary musicians and actors who had been part of that orbit. The Hollywood Vampires, however, time and mortality had taken their toll on its founding and early members. Some had survived and some didn't. Keith Moon, one of rock's greatest drummers and greater characters, died in London in 1978 at the flat owned by Harry Nilsson. He died from an overdose of a prescription drug, heminevrin, which was prescribed to combat alcoholism. He was trying to get off the booze. And that was the very same flat that Mama Cass died in. Harry Nilsson used to let all his friends stay in the flat when they were in London. Okay, so that's kind of a wrap up here. I want to thank you all for watching this show on my Royce in the House YouTube channel. Please go to the channel. We have 252 videos. This will be on the playlist Live Music Podcasts. And there's, like I said, a lot of different playlists, a lot of different fun music shows. And please, while you're there, do me a proper and subscribe. The show's been building. We're looking for new subscribers. You're welcome to go to the channel at any time and watch any video you want, subscriber or non-subscriber. But the subscribing helps the show to grow and sustain itself and motivates us to keep going, keep digging, and keep bringing you great shows. So thank you all very much once again. And that's what's happening in Royce's world today. Thank you so much for joining me.